I am the Ascended Master Moore, and it is my joy to address you and give you a teaching that may seem a little difficult and a little heavy to you, but that nevertheless is important for your grasping what your divine plan is all about and how to implement it. My beloved, Mother Mary raised the question of why we have not given more teachings on your divine plan earlier, and she, of course, partly answered the question, but I want to bring out another facet. In a previous dispensation, we gave more teachings on the divine plan. We put more emphasis on it. We said that people had to balance their karma, they had a sacred labor they had to fulfill. And what we saw in many cases was that when people heard about this concept, they went into a quite unbalanced reaction. Now, I'm not saying this to in any way criticize anyone, but I am seeking to point out here that many students, especially in previous decades, when they heard about the concept of a divine plan, they became very enthusiastic about carrying it out. And there is, of course, nothing inherently wrong with enthusiasm. You need a certain amount of enthusiasm on the spiritual path. But on the other hand, you have the old saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I can also say that the vehicle that takes you to hell is fueled by overly enthusiastic intentions. And so many people have taken our teachings in an unbalanced way and used them to bring themselves into a state that they would see as quite positive, because they are just being eager and anxious and determined and blue ray and blue flame, and they are not letting anything stand in their way of the fulfillment of their divine plan. And so, in a sense, it is as if you have one of these rallies that go through the countryside where you are supposed to get to a certain destination, and these students get so eager that they jump into the rally car and they step on the accelerator and they are speeding down the road with the gravel spraying to all sides of the car, but they have not brought the map that will bring them to their destination. They are so focused on moving as fast as possible that they are not ready or even have considered where they are going and how to actually get there. We have said before that one of the big problems with Ascended Master students is that you have a correct vision of what needs to happen, or at least a change needs to happen, or you don't have a correct vision of the how, of how this can be brought about. And so, one of the reasons we have not given more teachings about the divine plan in this dispensation is that we have been more careful, taken more time to gradually build up to where you have the understanding and the practical tools in the form of the invocations and the books, where you can actually deal with the opposition. And of course, you have the practical tools to deal with whatever it is in your psychology that causes you an unbalanced reaction. And so I'm not specifically speaking to those of you who are here, but also to many other people who might find this teaching and maybe even hear about a divine plan for the first time. And so it is important to be aware that when you first find an Ascended Master teaching, and especially when you hear about the concept of divine plan, but also about the concept of a golden age and how to change the earth, it is not uncommon that people take this in an imbalanced way. And what is the imbalance exactly? Well, that is to a large degree an individual matter. So it depends on your psychology. And what it really depends on is your primal self that you created in response to the original birth trauma that you experienced in your first embodiment, most likely. Sometimes it was not in the first, but in one of the following. And so, when you experienced that trauma, there were, of course, certain feelings, certain thoughts about this, and this often caused you to create a certain self that is looking for some way, so to speak, to even the score, to compensate, to set things right because of the birth trauma you received. In other words, this self is saying, the fallen beings did this to me. I want to even the score. I want to, whatever it may be individually, but you want to do something to them, with them, or you want to see something happen to them that, so to speak, evens the score and you feel like they got what they deserved. And this can cause some of you to become, as I said, overly enthusiastic about changing the world. And in many cases, this has caused some students to go into a period where they are so focused on the outer things. One thing many people have done is, of course, become very eager at giving decrees and giving hours and hours of decrees. And in the old dispensation, going to services several times a week and giving hours of decrees there. And so they thought that they had to do this in order to change the world, to bind the fallen beings, to balance the karma, and change the world for Saint Germain. And therefore, they had no need and no time or attention to work on their psychology. And this was, of course, you can go back and you can say, well, they did this because of what was said in dictations, or at least how what was said in dictations was interpreted in the organizational culture. And this is true. But again, as we have now said several times, we must look at a certain group of people at a certain time, see what they are ready for, give them that, sometimes even give them something to such an extreme that they will eventually have had enough of it and start looking beyond it. And so there were some people at the time who were simply, some of them were not ready, but some of them were not willing to look at their own psychology. And so we gave them this outer environment where they had the perfect excuse for not looking at their psychology because they had to give all these decrees. But on the other hand, there were so many things said about what decrees needed to be given that if you followed all of them 24 hours a day wasn't enough. So this was an attempt from our part to say, well, we can't reach them, we can't make them see what they need to see, so let us then give them so much that it eventually becomes too much, and hopefully some of them at least will step back and find a more balanced approach. And some indeed did so, and some did not, and that is unfortunately what we have to accept, that we cannot reach everybody with any teaching. And so my point here is that in today's age and in your dispensation, you have a different level of teaching. And you have much more emphasis on your personal growth, on the resolution and healing of your psychology and these past traumas that we have recently told you about. And this means that you have the potential to take a much more balanced approach. And just as Mother Mary has already mentioned, but I want to go into this a little more, the true goal of the Ascended Masters is not to produce specific outer changes on earth. You may say, but does that not contradict the teachings about Saint Germain's golden age, where he wants to improve all aspects of life on earth and bring forth a higher level of civilization? Well, yes and no, my beloved. From an outer linear perspective, it may seem to contradict. But even Saint Germain has said himself that his main goal for the golden age is actually to raise people's consciousness, not to bring these specific outer things into manifestation. He is using the outer things as a tool for raising people's consciousness. And they are not an end in itself. And so you have to recognize here that we have given you the concept that the Earth is not a natural planet. We have told you that there are billions of other planets in the universe that are at the level of being natural planets and therefore not having all of the fear-based manifestations you see on Earth. But as Mother Mary hinted at, there are actually billions of planets that have accelerated, where the inhabitants have accelerated the planet to a level that is so far beyond Earth that most people could scarcely fathom it. And so you have to recognize that we are the Ascended Masters, as a broad group of beings, are of course very well aware that most planets are at a higher level. Now, of course, those of us who have chosen to stay with Earth and work with Earth are not so focused on these higher planets, but we of course know that they exist. And we have interactions with the Ascended Masters who are working with these planets, and even the ones who have the overall vision for the entire material universe and how that universe evolves. And so that means that we have a sense of proportion that you don't often have on Earth when you are in embodiment. Many people on Earth are very focused on Earth, and of course many people think it is the only inhabited planet. Many Christians think it must be a very important planet to God. Many New Age and spiritual people think it is important because it makes them important that they are here, and so forth and so on. So what I wish to give you is a little bit of the sense of proportion that we have as Ascended Masters. So when you step back and look at the entire material universe, you know from science how there are billions of galaxies, billions of suns, billions of solar systems, billions of planets that could potentially have life. But I tell you, what science has discovered of the so-called Earth-like planets is only a fraction of the planets that have life, because you're looking for planets that have the same type of life that you have on Earth. But there are, of course, many other types of life that are, so to speak, not carbon-based, but are based on other chemical elements that are therefore not visible to the physical senses and the sense-based scientific instruments you have on Earth. That is why you cannot see life on Venus, even though we have told you that there is life on Venus. And the same goes for many other planets throughout the universe. So when you step back, look from this broader perspective, you are clearly seeing that the vast majority of the planets are accelerating very quickly. The inhabitants there are in a positive spiral, a self-reinforcing positive spiral, because as they interact with the Ascended Masters, as they raise their consciousness, the Masters can give them more light, and then they can accelerate themselves even more, and this becomes a positive upward spiral. So there is a relatively small number of planets that are like Earth. And how do we then, when we have this broader perspective, how do we look at Earth? And of course, we look at the Earth as clearly not being one of these planets that have gone into a self-reinforcing, accelerating spiral. There is an upward spiral on Earth, but it has not become self-reinforcing because there hasn't been a critical mass of the inhabitants who are in physical embodiment who have gone into raising their consciousness. So Earth is largely being pulled up by the rest of the universe, by the Ascended Masters, and by the few people in embodiment who are raising their consciousness. And so this type of planet is a planet where we look at it as largely a teaching device for beings who cannot learn directly from within. And therefore, they need to have a planet where they can see a physical outpicturing of their state of consciousness. Grant you, most people are not aware of this, are not even open to the idea, and if you told them, they would just shake their heads and think you're crazy. And so, but nevertheless, the reality is that Earth is outpicturing people's state of consciousness. When you know this, you need to ask yourself a simple question. If Earth is outpicturing the state of consciousness of the people upon it, is there any condition on Earth that is ultimately real, that has any longevity, any endurance, that has any ongoing eternal value? And the reality is, there is really nothing on Earth that needs to be preserved, that we of the Ascended Masters want to see preserved in the long run. Everything here is a temporary manifestation that we clearly see needs to be transcended before the Earth becomes a natural planet. You may look at the Earth and say, well, if the Earth makes the change to become a natural planet, isn't there anything of the current conditions that will endure? And for many people, shocking answer would be, not really. There's hardly anything here that would endure in its present form when the Earth becomes a natural planet again. Because, my beloved, the primary thing that will change when the Earth goes back to the state of being a natural planet is that the density of matter will decrease. The vibration of matter will be increased. And this means that most of the physical conditions, including what scientists call the laws of nature that exist right now, will simply be transcended. The Earth will accelerate beyond it. And so, with this in mind, you can gain the perspective that it is not so ultimately important to the Ascended Masters that a certain condition be changed, a certain physical condition. And that means that you can then make the shift that also Mother Mary talked about and say, well, what am I then supposed to do as part of my divine plan? If I made my divine plan from a higher level of awareness than I have right now, what did I then incorporate in my divine plan that I was supposed to do in the physical? What changes am I here to help bring about? And this is, of course, a highly individual question. Because even though I say that the physical conditions are not ultimately important, they are, of course, part of the entire equation of the Earth. So it will not be possible to move into the golden age or to move the Earth to a natural state without bringing about many changes that are physical, including new ideas, new inventions, new technology, new form of government, new forms of education, new forms of culture and art, and so forth and so on. So indeed, there are many physical changes that need to happen. But I find it very, very important to give you this perspective that these changes are not ultimate. They are not final. They are steps on the way. They are stages in the transition process. And this is primarily to help you avoid going into this reaction